What's up, YouTube? Welcome back. This is 82 and 0, talking about one of my personal favorite teams. And one of my friends who I play a lot of 2K with, I always, whenever we'd play a best of 7, he hates me for this, but anytime we go to a game 7, I pick the 65 Celtics. Can't stand playing against them. So, who are the 65 Celtics? In many people's eyes, they are the greatest Bill Russell team. Some people will say 62. Some people say 69 just because of the story. But in my personal opinion, it's 63 or 65. I say 63 because of the depth. I say 65 because of the overall dominance and talent. So the team. This is the first team to go 62 and 18. That was the best record ever in NBA history at the time, which would eventually get broken. They held the first best defensive rating in the league. They had an SRS of 7.46. So what is their story? Coached by the legendary Red Auerbach, and this was towards the middle of that Celtics dynasty. At this point, they were still on their eight win streak of NBA Finals. This was championship number 8 in total, and this was their 7th championship in a row. So, what is their story? Prior to that season, the beginning of the season, the legendary Celtics owner had passed away. And his name was Walter Brown. So Bill Russell was pretty close with Walter Brown. And Walter Brown had been there since the beginning of the Celtics. And Bill Russell promised people he was going to win it all for Walter Brown. Now, that's a lot easier said than done, but, it is the Celtics. So, what made this team so great was their talent. They had a lot of different ways they could attack you. At the guards, you had point guard in Casey Jones, who's one of the greatest defensive point guards we've ever seen. He's a Hall of Famer. He played at the University of San Francisco with Russell, so they had a lot of good chemistry. In that season, although his numbers alone, the 8.3 points per game, the 5.6 assists per game, his numbers, maybe don't jump out at you. But in crunch time and late in games, he had an act for stealing the ball. And he is one of the greatest defensive point guards. He averaged 7 defensive win shares that year. His backup was Larry Siegfried. Now, Siegfried, a lot of people probably don't remember him. He wasn't a Hall of Famer. He wasn't an All-Star like all these other guys on the team. But the thing about Siegfried was he was a very great shooter. He could come off the bench and give you a lot of production. And this was just his second season. He hadn't really broken out yet. Later on in his career, he'd average 14 points per game with the Celtics. And he would be there actually up until their 11th title. But, this was early in his career. But nonetheless, he was a great offensive player. Coming in at the shooting guard, you had Sam Jones, who I consider the Kobe of that generation. Never afraid to take a last-minute shot. Never afraid to take the last bucket. I would like to see a stat, because there's all these stats about Kobe Bryant's game winners or LeBron's. I'd like to see a chart of Sam Jones. Very clutch, very efficient. Average 45% field goal shooting for his career. He's a career 80% free throw shooter. And this is the first season where he had really showed what he could do. Before then, he was just a guy playing his role, right? another guy on the team just to score baskets when needed. But this is when he got the keys to show how good of a scorer he was. He improved his scoring to 25.9 points per game on 45% shooting, absolutely torching the league, right? The number one scoring option now. And the backup for him is, lo and behold, John Havlicek. John Havlicek was definitely good enough to be a starter. But going into the 64-65 season, this would be his third season. At 24 years old, he averaged 18.3 points per game, 4.9 rebounds per game, 2.7 assists per game. He played 28 minutes a game. So what made John Havlicek so good? He was well-rounded. He could do everything. He was a great shooter. He was clutch. Played great defense. He was a great passer, a great playmaker. He was never afraid to guard the best wing player on the opposing team. And also what made him so good is he'd never get tired. His stamina was something we haven't seen yet. And really, to be honest with you, it's something we haven't seen in a long time. He would never really get that fatigue feeling. He could run up and down the court maybe thousands of times, or hundreds of times a game. He never gets tired. But this isn't really the breakout Havlicek yet, right? His minutes are limited. Although he would go on in the 70s to lead the Celtics, for example, some of his best years, like the 71 season, for example, he'd average 28.9 points per game, 9 rebounds, and 7.5 assists. So I also want to point out he's an 8-time All-Defense. So while your opposing team's second unit's coming out, you're facing John Havlicek. A guy who doesn't get tired, a guy who plays great defense. But coming in at the small forwards, we got Willie Knowles. Now, Willie Knowles is one of the most forgotten all-stars of all time. Why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? Someone wants to tell me why he's not in the Hall of Fame. I'm all ears. He's a 4-time All-Star. All of his All-Star appearances were before he joined the Boston Celtics. He joined the Boston Celtics the year prior. He had really great years in the 50s with the New York Knicks, or the 50s and early 60s. For example, his best season came in 1961-62, where he averaged 25 points and 11 rebounds. Great rebounder, got as high as 14 rebounds per game. But playing for the Celtics team, he would average 10 points and 4 rebounds. That didn't mean that he fall off as a player. It just meant he's on a better team. And his nickname was the Whale. And when he came over to Boston, they were worried about his weight. But, Red Auerbach always had a tough training method. If you wanted to play on the Celtics, you had to be able to run and you had to be able to play defense. So, you also had, in my eyes, Hall of Famer in Willie Knowles. Now, Tom Heinsohn, their other small forward, great Hall of Famer. This would be his final season. He put up 13 points, 6 rebounds, and he took a lot of bad shots. This is why his field goal shooting is misleading. He took a lot of three-pointers, which they didn't have three-pointers back then, so there was no real benefit to taking them. But he took a lot of outside shots. And he was a great rebounder, probably the third best rebounder on that, fourth best rebounder after Willie Knowles. But at this point in their career, he's the third best. 8-time champion, 4-time All-NBA, 6-time All-Star. Tom Heinsohn, could torture you from outside. He had great post moves, too. Now, who else did they have? Coming in at their power forward, they had Tom Sanders. Tom Sanders, probably the most underrated defender of the 60s. Hall of Famer as a contributor in 2011. That's when he was inducted, not as a player, which is a travesty. He did make an all defense in 1969 when they introduced it, but had the all defense existed, he would have won it every year that he played, probably other than his rookie season prior to that. So in the 64-65 season, he put up 11 points, 8 rebounds, probably the team's second best rebounder. They had the legendary John Thompson, who was a Hall of Fame coach later in his career, coming off the bench as their backup power forward. And of course, at the center, I'll go into the backup first because I want to save the best for last. Mel Counts, backup center, rookie year. He was a pretty solid player, not a Hall of Famer, not an All Star, but his best would be like 12 points and 8 rebounds. Good backup big. Now Bill Russell, greatest defensive player of all time, probably would have won like 8 defensive players of the year. So that's their starting center. And in the 64-65 season, he'd average 14 points and 24 rebounds. He's a 5-time MVP. And I think what made the 64-65 season so good for him is, check this out, he averaged 14.4 defensive win shares. Absolutely freaking insane. Name another player with that many defensive win shares. Now, this team didn't have quite as easy of a roll through to the finals as you think they would. Their first matchup, because back then it was 2 rounds. The year prior they would switch. The year following they'd switch it to 3 rounds, but this year it was 2 rounds. So their very first round was in the Eastern Division Finals against the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, the Philadelphia 76ers had recently acquired Wilt Chamberlain. And Wilt was on a very good team. They had guys like Hal Greer, Luke Jackson, and this would go to a grueling 7 games. And in that 7th game, Russell was supposed to inbound the ball. They were up 110 to 109. And there was a guide wire right above the basket, right? And Russell, he didn't see it. And so when he threw the ball up to throw a long pass, it hit the guard wire and, it cost them their possession. And there was still like 3 to 4 seconds left in the game. So Philly had the ball. They were right under the basket. All they had to do, Hal Greer was inbounding. All they had to do was throw it to Wilt for an inside dunk or whoever, right? And John Havlicek, when they threw the ball, he jumped up, grabbed it, threw it off to his guy, his teammate. His teammate dribbled out so they couldn't foul him. Then he threw it back to Havlicek. They played a keep-away game until the game was up, the last few seconds. And they won the game, 110 to 109. And there's the famous Havlicek stole the ball, And the fans went nuts. They ran up and they actually started ripping off John Havlicek's clothes. They ripped off his jersey. They tried to rip off his shorts. He didn't let him rip off his shorts, he started punching him. But anyways, they advanced to the finals where they were matched up against the Elgin Baylor-less Los Angeles Lakers. Now, this Lakers team did not stand a prayer without Elgin Baylor. And the Celtics steamrolled them. They won in 5 games, and it wasn't even close. To give you an example, right? So the game 1 that they played, the Celtics won 142 to 110. And overall in that series, they averaged 123 points per game, the Celtics, and the Lakers averaged 110. So that's the 64-65 Celtics story, capping off their 7th championship in a row, their 8th total. Very deep team, and this is one of the most forgotten teams of all time. Why aren't they up there with the 72 Lakers or the 96 Bulls? That's beyond me, because this team, in my eyes, is up there. So this team was actually named in 1997. So when they had the 50th greatest players celebration in 1997, they also had what is called the 10 greatest teams in NBA history. And they were selected to it. And this team has 5 players who were inducted to the Hall of Fame: Casey Jones, Sam Jones, Tom Heinsohn, Bill Russell, John Havlicek, and, in my eyes, Willie Knowles and Tom Sanders should be a Hall of Famers as players. Absolute travesty. They had the legendary coach Red Auerbach, who actually won Coach of the Year. Bill Russell won MVP. Bill Russell was All-NBA first team. Sam Jones was All-NBA second team. And had they had all defensive teams back then, they wouldn't. They would have a. Let's see. And this is just my speculation. This is just my theory, right? My theory is Bill Russell gets all defensive first team. Sanders gets all defensive first team at the forward. And Casey Jones gets all defensive first team at the guard. Maybe second. So they got 3 guys on all defense. So what are your thoughts about the 65 Celtics? Let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks for watching.